It was a crisp autumn morning in the small, quiet town of Willowbrook, tucked away in the heart of Michigan. The trees lined the streets with fiery reds and golden yellows, the kind of scenery that made every passerby pause and appreciate the peacefulness. But the calm of the day would be shattered within hours, and life in Willowbrook would never be the same again. The Spencer family lived in a modest two-story house on Pine Street. Carla Spencer, a 43-year-old mother of two, had always been seen as the perfect homemaker, always friendly, always involved in the community, and the proud wife of Jake Spencer, a local mechanic. Their daughter Emily was 18, bright and promising, with her whole life ahead of her. Carla also had a son, Mark, who was 2 years younger than Emily, and a boy who had inherited his mother's charm and his father's work ethic. But things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic suburban life, secrets festered, secrets that no one could have ever imagined. It all began on this particular morning. The Spencer family had gathered around the breakfast table. Carla was making pancakes, humming softly to herself as she moved about the kitchen. Her husband Jake sat at the table reading the newspaper, while Emily, looking a little out of sorts, sipped her coffee. Mark was scrolling through his phone, uninterested in anything else. There was an air of normalcy, a mundane calm that made everything seem right in the world. But then, the phone rang. The call came in at 8:45 a.m. "Hello, this is Officer Gregson," the voice on the other end said, sharp and direct. "I'm afraid we found something in the woods just off of Sutherland Road. A body. We need you to come down to the station." Carla's heart skipped a beat. Her pulse quickened. She set down the pancake spatula, her hands trembling slightly. It wasn't unusual for the police to contact local residents for various reasons, but the urgency in Officer Gregson's voice sent a wave of unease through her. "Carla, what is it?" Jake asked, lifting his head from the newspaper, his brow furrowed in concern. Carla's lips were dry. She couldn't speak at first, her throat tight. The words finally broke free, but they were hard to say, even harder to believe. I I think they found Emily." The air in the room thickened. Emily looked up at her mother, her face pale. "What do you mean? What's happened to her?" Carla's mind was racing as she tried to make sense of the phone call. Had something happened to her daughter? She had seen Emily only a few hours ago, when she had gone to bed the night before. She had seemed fine, no signs of anything being wrong. Jake stood up abruptly. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady despite the worry evident in his eyes. The family got in the car and made their way to the station. Carla's heart was hammering in her chest, each second feeling like an eternity. When they arrived, they were greeted by Officer Gregson, a seasoned officer who had been working in Willowbrook for years. His expression was grave as he led them to a small room in the back. "Mrs. Spencer," Officer Gregson began, his voice low, "I'm afraid your daughter has been found dead. We believe it's a homicide." Carla's knees nearly gave way beneath her. No, it can't be." Jake pulled her into his arms as the weight of the officer's words hit her. "Emily, dead." But Emily was just a teenager. What could have happened? "We're still investigating," Gregson continued, "but we need you to come down to the morgue and identify her body." The ride to the morgue was a blur for Carla. Her mind was spinning. Emily couldn't be dead. She couldn't be. But when they arrived at the morgue and Carla saw her daughter's lifeless body on the cold metal table, reality hit hard. Emily's face was pale, her body still and silent. She was dressed in a simple white t-shirt and jeans, the clothes she had worn the day before. There were no visible signs of injury, but the look in Carla's eyes told a different story. She could feel the truth creeping up on her. Something was wrong, something beyond her comprehension. The police were tight-lipped about the details of the case, but the look in their eyes, particularly Officer Gregson's, told her everything she needed to know. Emily hadn't died of an accident. No, this was intentional, and someone in her family had to have been involved. Investigation report, date of incident, October 15th, 2025. Location of discovery, Sutherland Road, Willowbrook, Michigan. Victim, Emily Spencer, age 18. Cause of death, pending autopsy. The victim was found in a wooded area off Sutherland Road at approximately 8:30 a.m. by a local jogger. No visible wounds were present on the victim's body, which initially suggested the cause of death could be asphyxiation or poisoning, though these details are still being examined. The victim's clothing was unremarkable, suggesting she had not been forcibly abducted. Carla Spencer, the victim's mother, was visibly distressed but composed when questioned. Initial statements from family members, including Emily's father, Jake Spencer, indicate no known conflicts or concerns involving the victim, but the family's tight-knit nature raises suspicion. The family did not report any issues or disappearances leading up to the discovery of the body. The investigation was just beginning. But one thing was already clear. This wasn't a random act of violence. Someone close to Emily had orchestrated her death, and it would only be a matter of time before the truth came to light. The sun had barely risen over Willowbrook when the investigation into Emily Spencer's death began in earnest. Officers, detectives, and forensic specialists scoured the wooded area off Sutherland Road where her body had been discovered. The peaceful landscape, once vibrant with autumn's colors, now felt cold and sinister as the quiet of the morning was pierced by the bustle of law enforcement. Detective Laura Harris was assigned to the case. She was seasoned, having been with the Willowbrook Police Department for over 15 years. Harris was methodical, with an eye for detail and a reputation for uncovering the truth no matter how deeply it was buried. She had seen many cases like this before. Young victims, families with hidden secrets. But there was something about this one that felt different. The victim, Emily, was just a teenager, and the idea that someone close to her might have been responsible for her death weighed heavily on Harris's mind. By mid-morning, the body had been transported to the morgue for an autopsy. Detective Harris and her team were gathered in the small conference room at the police station, reviewing the preliminary details. A file on Emily Spencer sat open on the table before them, full of personal details and information about the family. Her mother, Carla, was pretty shaken up. Officer Gregson, who had been the first to receive the call, said as he leaned against the table, "I don't know if that's just grief or something else." Laura Harris nodded, her eyes scanning the file. "We need to take a closer look at the family dynamics. Something's not adding up. Carla Spencer seems too composed, too willing to cooperate. And her husband, Jake, he's just as calm as she is." "It's hard to say," Gregson replied. "They've been married for over 20 years. No signs of trouble in the relationship. But Emily, she was a good kid. No major behavioral issues. She was on track to go to college." Harris's brow furrowed. "We're dealing with someone who's hiding something. Let's go talk to Carla again. She's going to be the key to this case." Carla Spencer sat in the small interrogation room, the walls painted a dull shade of gray. She looked every bit the grieving mother, eyes red from crying, face pale and strained. Yet there was a calmness about her that was unsettling. She had answered the police's questions earlier, but this time, Harris would take a different approach. It was time to dig deeper. "Mrs. Spencer," Harris began gently, sitting across from her, "I know this is incredibly hard for you, but we need to ask you a few more questions." Carla nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I understand, Detective. I'll do whatever I can to help." Harris leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Carla's face. "I know this is painful, but we have to ask. Did Emily have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt her?" Carla shook her head. "Number Emily was a sweet girl. She had a boyfriend, Derek. They'd been seeing each other for a few months, but she never mentioned any problems between them." "Derek?" Harris repeated, her mind racing. "You're sure? Was he close to the family?" Carla's expression faltered for a moment, just enough to catch Harris's trained eye. "Yes, Derek was, well, he was like family. We liked him. He was polite, respectful. He came over to our house a lot, spent time with Emily. I never saw any signs of trouble." Harris made a mental note of this. Emily's boyfriend Derek could be a lead, but something in Carla's voice didn't sit right. There was a hesitation, a slight crack in her otherwise calm demeanor. "Tell me about Emily's relationship with her father," Harris pressed. "Jake, her dad, did they have a good relationship?" Carla hesitated for a moment longer than usual. Jake. Jake was a good father. He worked hard for the family. He wasn't always home, but when he was, he spent time with the kids. Emily and Mark never had any complaints. Harris leaned back in her chair, her gaze sharp. But there's something you're not telling me. I can see it. You're holding something back, Mrs. Spencer? Carla's face tightened, and for the first time Harris saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. I I don't know what you mean. Harris's voice softened, but her tone remained firm. We need to know everything. The smallest detail could be the key to finding out who did this to Emily. If there's something you're not telling us, it's going to make things harder for everyone, especially for you. Carla swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. I don't know. I don't know who would want to hurt Emily. She was a good girl. She was planning to go to college in the fall. She had a future. Just as Harris was about to press her further, the door to the interrogation room opened, and Officer Gregson stepped in, holding a folder in his hands. Detective, Gregson said, his voice low, we got the preliminary results back from the autopsy. Harris stood up, signaling to Carla that the conversation was over. For now. We'll continue this soon, Mrs. Spencer, but don't leave town. We may have more questions. Carla nodded, her face drawn and weary. She stood up, her eyes distant, and walked out of the room, leaving Harris alone with her thoughts. The autopsy results confirmed Harris's suspicions. Emily had not died from an accidental fall, as some had initially speculated. No, she had been strangled. The coroner's report indicated that there were no signs of a struggle, which suggested that the killer had been someone Emily trusted. The lack of defensive wounds meant that she hadn't fought back, but it was the discovery of a small, subtle bruise on Emily's neck, just below her jaw, that caught Harris's attention. It was an unusual spot for someone to strangle another person, especially without leaving larger bruising or marks. It looked like a handprint, a subtle yet undeniable impression left by someone's grip. Someone close to her, Harris muttered to herself. But who? The boyfriend? The parents? Or maybe someone else entirely? As Harris sat in her office going over the case file once again, something struck her. Emily had been pregnant. It wasn't something the Spencer family had mentioned, but the coroner had found evidence of an early pregnancy in Emily's body. The thought made Harris freeze. A secret pregnancy? This could change everything. Emily had been pregnant, and that could explain the fear in Carla's eyes earlier. The mother knew more than she was letting on. The question now was, did Carla know about the pregnancy? Or had it been kept secret from everyone? Detective Harris's intuition told her that the answers lay buried in Emily's past, in the people closest to her. It was time to dig deeper. The investigation was about to take a darker turn. The days following the discovery of Emily Spencer's body passed in a blur for Detective Laura Harris. With each passing hour, she felt the weight of the investigation grow heavier, and with it, the undeniable sense that the people closest to Emily had something to hide. The case was unraveling at a pace that she could hardly keep up with, but she knew she had to keep pushing. The truth was buried deep within the Spencer family, and it was her job to dig it out, no matter how ugly it might be. It was clear now that Emily had been pregnant. The coroner's report made that undeniable. But who was the father? And why had no one in the Spencer family mentioned it? It had to be someone close, someone who had been hiding the secret. Carla Spencer had been evasive, and Jake, Emily's father, hadn't shown any signs of suspicion. There was a gaping hole in the story, one that Harris was determined to fill. Harris spent the morning reviewing the case file again, going over every scrap of evidence. Her mind kept circling back to Emily's boyfriend, Derek. According to Carla, Derek had been a steady, well-liked young man. But there was something nagging at Harris, something she couldn't put her finger on. She knew she needed to speak with Derek. It was late afternoon when Detective Harris found herself standing in front of a modest house just outside Willowbrook, a place where Emily's boyfriend Derek had been living for the past year. His family, it seemed, was well off. The house was large and well kept, nestled on the outskirts of the town in a neighborhood of neatly trimmed lawns and quiet streets. As Harris approached the front door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. She had questioned enough people to know that things weren't adding up. There was a darkness lurking beneath the surface of this small town, and Emily's death had dragged it into the light. The door swung open, and Derek's mother, a sharp-faced woman in her early 40s, greeted Harris with a polite smile. "Can I help you, Detective?" "I'm Detective Harris from the Willowbrook Police Department. I need to speak with Derek," Harris said, her voice steady but firm. "Of course," Derek's mother replied, stepping aside to let Harris enter. "He's in the living room. Let me know if you need anything." Derek was sitting on the couch, his legs crossed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when Harris entered the room, his expression shifting from casual indifference to one of polite concern. "Detective Harris," he said, standing up and offering a handshake. "I'm sorry to hear about Emily. This whole thing is just awful." Harris shook his hand but didn't sit down. She needed to keep control of this conversation. "I know this must be difficult for you, Derek. I'm sorry to have to ask you more questions, but I need your help." Derek nodded, his face serious. "Of course. Anything." Harris studied him for a moment before asking, "I understand you and Emily were close. She mentioned that she was planning to go to college soon. How was your relationship with her? Did anything change recently?" Derek's eyes darted briefly to the floor, and Harris noticed the tension in his jaw. "We were fine," he said quickly. "I mean, we were doing well. There wasn't anything wrong. You didn't notice anything unusual? Any signs that something was off?" Harris pressed. Derek hesitated for a moment longer, then shook his head. Nothing unusual." Harris wasn't convinced. Something was wrong, and Derek knew more than he was letting on. She decided to take a different approach. "I understand that Emily had a secret," she said, her voice quiet but direct. "A pregnancy. Did you know about it?" The words hit Derek like a physical blow. His face drained of color, and for a split second, he looked like he might collapse. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair, trying to compose himself. "Emily, she didn't tell me. Not at first anyway," he finally confessed, his voice breaking. "But I found out about it a couple of weeks ago." Harris leaned in. "How?" Derek's eyes welled up with emotion, but he forced himself to speak. "She came to me. She said she was pregnant. She was scared. She didn't know what to do." Harris's mind raced. "What did you say to her?" "I told her I would be there for her, that we would figure it out together," Derek said, his voice trembling. "But she wasn't sure what to do. She was so scared. She didn't want her parents to find out." "Did you ever meet with Emily outside of school? Did you ever spend time together alone?" Harris asked, narrowing her eyes. Derek shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twisting nervously. "Yeah, a few times. We would sneak off to the woods, or sometimes we just hang out at her house when her parents weren't home. But I swear I never hurt her, Detective." Harris nodded, trying to piece the information together. Derek had known about the pregnancy, but there was no indication that he had been violent. Could someone else have found out about it and decided to take matters into their own hands? "I'm going to need to speak with your parents, Derek," Harris said, keeping her voice even. "This may be more complicated than it seems." Derek's face darkened, and he opened his mouth to protest, but then closed it again. "I understand," he said softly. "You can talk to them." Before Harris could leave, she turned back to Derek. "Tell me one thing, Derek. Was there anyone you think might have wanted to hurt Emily? Someone who might have found out about the pregnancy?" Derek's face turned pale. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Finally, he said in a whisper, "I don't know, but there's something you should know. Emily's mom, Carla, she was acting strange the last time I saw her, like she was hiding something. She was cold, distant. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" Harris's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean by acting strange, Derek?" Derek bit his lip, clearly conflicted. She looked at me differently, almost like she was angry. And I saw her and Emily arguing once, right before Emily went missing. It was in the kitchen and they were shouting. I didn't hear the words, but I could tell they were upset. I think Emily wanted to tell her something, but Carla wasn't having it. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Could Carla Spencer have known about the pregnancy? Was she the one who had orchestrated Emily's death to cover up the truth? Derek's words sent a chill down Harris's spine. The investigation was taking a darker turn, and now it seemed the key to solving the case might lie with Emily's mother. Investigation report. Date of interview, October 17th, 2025. Subject, Derek Montgomery, 19, Emily Spencer's boyfriend. Details. Derek confirmed that Emily had confided in him about her pregnancy, but he was unaware of any other potential suspects. Derek expressed concern over Emily's mother, Carla Spencer, who he described as acting strangely and possibly hiding something. Derek reported a heated argument between Emily and Carla shortly before Emily went missing. Suspect, Carla Spencer. Carla's behavior, combined with the mounting evidence of a secret pregnancy, now puts her at the center of the investigation. Further questioning is required to determine her involvement in Emily's death. As Detective Harris left Derek's house, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear: Emily's death had not been an accident, and Carla Spencer was hiding something much darker than anyone could have imagined. The investigation was accelerating. Every turn, every interview, every piece of evidence was pointing to one undeniable conclusion. Emily Spencer's murder was not a random act of violence. It was deliberate, calculated, and this was the most disturbing part, its roots seemed to lie within the Spencer family itself. A mother who was seemingly grieving her daughter's loss, yet whose actions and evasiveness suggested something much darker. A father who appeared distraught but had yet to offer anything substantial. And now the revelation that Emily's pregnancy, kept secret from everyone, might have been the catalyst for her death. Detective Laura Harris sat in her office, flipping through the case file. The report from Derek Montgomery, Emily's boyfriend, had raised several crucial points. The argument between Emily and her mother, Carla, was now at the forefront of Harris's mind. Derek's words rang in her ears. Carla wasn't having it. She was angry. Anger, guilt, a hidden truth. The pieces were slowly clicking into place, but there were still gaps that Harris needed to fill. It was time to confront Carla Spencer again. The next day, Harris stood at the door of the Spencer family home, the air heavy with the tension of unspoken words. Carla had been cooperative during her initial questioning, but Harris knew that was just the calm before the storm. Something had changed in her behavior since Emily's death, something Harris couldn't quite put her finger on. Now it was time to break through her facade. Jake Spencer answered the door. His face was haggard from lack of sleep, and his eyes were red-rimmed with grief. His posture slumped as if the weight of his daughter's death had crushed him into a permanent state of exhaustion. "Detective Harris," Jake greeted, his voice strained. "Please come in." "Thank you, Mr. Spencer," Harris said, stepping inside. She noted the silence in the house, an unnatural stillness that hung heavy in the air. It felt as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Carla was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up when Harris entered, offering a weak, almost automatic smile. But there was something off about it, something forced. "Mrs. Spencer," Harris began, her voice steady but probing, "I need to ask you a few more questions about Emily." Carla's face tightened, but she nodded, her lips trembling slightly. "Of course, I'll do anything to help." "I understand this is difficult," Harris said, sitting down opposite her, "but there are some things we still need to clear up." Carla's eyes flickered with something, unease, fear, before she composed herself. What more could there be to say? Emily is gone. We just want to bury her and move on. Harris's eyes narrowed. She could feel the walls coming up again, and she wasn't about to let them stay up for long. "Mrs. Spencer, we found some things that suggest there's more to this case than just a tragic accident. We've spoken to Derek Montgomery, Emily's boyfriend. He told us about your argument with Emily just before she disappeared. He mentioned that it was about something important, something she was afraid to tell you." Carla stiffened. "I don't know what he's talking about. I didn't have an argument with Emily. We were just, trying to figure out what to do about all of this. She was upset, yes, but what else could I do? She was my daughter. I wanted to protect her." Harris leaned forward, her tone gentle but direct. "Carla, I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you know about Emily's pregnancy?" The room seemed to grow colder. Carla's eyes widened, but only for a fraction of a second. She quickly recovered, but Harris had already seen the truth flash across her face. Carla knew. Yes, Carla admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I knew. Harris's heart raced. When did you find out? Carla's hands trembled in her lap. She took a deep breath, as if gathering strength for the truth she had been trying so hard to bury. A month ago, Emily came to me and told me. She was scared. She didn't know what to do. She begged me to help her figure it out. I I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do either. Did you tell Jake? Harris asked, watching Carla closely. Carla hesitated, her lips quivering. No, she said finally. I didn't want to tell him. He would have been furious. He wasn't the same person after Mark was born. He was distant. He didn't show it, but I could tell. He didn't want another child. He never talked about it, but I knew. I didn't want to make him angry. Harris's eyes flickered to Jake, who had remained silent in the corner of the room, his face unreadable. So you kept it a secret from him, Harris said. But why didn't you want Emily to tell anyone else? Why did you argue with her? Carla's eyes filled with tears, and she lowered her head, her voice shaking. I was scared. I knew what would happen if people found out. Willowbrook is a small town. People talk. I knew that if the truth came out, Emily's life would be ruined. She was going to lose everything. Her future, her reputation. I didn't want that for her, but I also didn't want to lose her. I was afraid of what might happen if anyone else found out. I didn't want to lose control. Harris sat back in her chair, absorbing the weight of Carla's words. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Emily's pregnancy was a secret, and Carla had been trying to protect it, a secret she was willing to kill for. I didn't want to lose her, Carla repeated, her voice hollow. I just wanted her to be safe. But did you think the only way to protect her was to kill her? Harris asked softly, her voice filled with an icy calm. Carla's eyes snapped up, wide with horror. No, I didn't mean to. But she wouldn't listen. She said she was going to tell Jake. She said she didn't care anymore. She was going to tell the world and everything would fall apart. She was going to ruin everything. Was it Emily's decision to go public that pushed you over the edge? Harris asked. Carla didn't respond right away. She stared at the floor, her face pale, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I couldn't let her do it. I couldn't let her ruin everything. I thought if I could just stop her, make her stay quiet, everything would go back to normal. She would still have a chance at a good future, and we could put all this behind us. And how did you stop her? Harris asked, her eyes never leaving Carla's face. Carla's lips trembled. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then stopped, shaking her head. Finally, after a long pause, she whispered, I never meant to kill her. I couldn't let her talk. She was going to tell Jake, and then everything would fall apart. So I pushed her. I pushed her in the kitchen, and she hit her head. I didn't mean to. The words came out in a rush, each one more desperate than the last. Carla's confession sent a chill through the room, and for the first time, the true horror of Emily Spencer's death began to reveal itself. Investigation report. Subject: Carla Spencer, 43, mother of Emily Spencer. Details: Carla Spencer confessed to having known about her daughter Emily's pregnancy. Carla admitted to an argument with Emily prior to her death, during which she tried to prevent Emily from revealing the pregnancy to her father Jake. Carla claimed that in a fit of fear and desperation, she pushed Emily during the argument, causing her to fall and hit her head. Carla maintains that she never intended to kill her daughter, but feared the consequences of the truth being revealed. Carla Spencer's motive appears to have been driven by a desire to protect her family's image and to shield Emily from the potential fallout of the pregnancy. The physical evidence of strangulation does not align with Carla's statement. Further investigation is required to determine whether the push led to Emily's head injury or if other factors were involved. Detective Harris stared at Carla Spencer, the confession now hanging heavy in the air. The investigation was far from over, but Harris could already see the pieces falling into place. Emily Spencer's murder had been born of fear, a fear of the truth and the potential destruction it could bring. But as always, the truth had a way of making its presence known, no matter how deeply it was buried. And now the truth was finally coming to light. Detective Laura Harris spent the next few hours pacing her office, processing the confession Carla Spencer had given. It was a confession that brought clarity, but also raised more questions. The guilt in Carla's voice had been palpable, yet something didn't sit right with Harris. Carla had admitted to pushing her daughter, but the physical evidence didn't align with the story Carla had told. Emily Spencer had been strangled. There was no indication of a fall or head injury that would have caused her death. The more Harris thought about it, the more she became convinced that Carla Spencer wasn't telling the full truth. Harris needed to speak with the coroner again. The sterile, cold smell of the morgue filled the air as Harris entered the small, dimly lit office, where Dr. Rachel Pierce, the county coroner, was reviewing the autopsy reports. Dr. Pierce looked up as Harris entered, giving her a brief professional nod. "Detective," Dr. Pierce said, her tone calm, "what brings you by today?" "I need to go over the autopsy findings again, specifically the cause of death," Harris replied, her voice steady but urgent. Dr. Pierce pulled the file from her desk and flipped it open. "You're referring to the strangulation?" she asked, scanning the details on the report. Harris nodded. "Yes, Carla Spencer admitted to pushing Emily during an argument, but that doesn't explain the cause of death. I need to be sure that the strangulation was the primary cause, not something else." Dr. Pierce adjusted her glasses, studying the report with careful precision. "You're correct to question the cause of death. The strangulation marks on Emily's neck are consistent and were the primary cause of her death. However, there was also significant blunt force trauma to the back of her head. A large contusion just below the skull suggested a hard impact, possibly against a hard surface." Harris frowned. "But Carla claims she pushed Emily. That wouldn't explain the force behind the impact." Dr. Pierce gave her a solemn look. "Exactly. The injury to her head is inconsistent with a simple fall. It's possible that she was struck with something hard. The bruising was too deep for a mere tumble or impact with the ground." Harris's thoughts raced. "So, you're suggesting that Emily may have been struck before she was strangled?" "Possibly," Dr. Pierce said, nodding. "The head injury could have been inflicted before the strangulation, or it could have been the result of a struggle afterward. But either way, the injury was significant enough that it likely contributed to her unconsciousness, making the strangulation easier to carry out." Harris's stomach turned. Carla Spencer's confession didn't match the evidence. Emily hadn't just been pushed. She'd been attacked. Someone had hit her with force before strangling her, possibly rendering her unconscious before finishing the job. "I need to look at Carla's story again," Harris murmured to herself, more to confirm her suspicions than anything else. "Thank you, Dr. Pierce. This helps a lot." As Harris left the morgue, the weight of the case began to settle heavier on her shoulders. The truth was slipping further away from Carla Spencer's confession, and the more Harris dug, the more she suspected that the mother's role in her daughter's death was far more complicated than she'd let on. The following morning, Harris met with her team. She went over the new information from the autopsy, Emily's head injury and the strangulation, and the inconsistencies in Carla Spencer's account. It was clear that Carla's version of events didn't hold up, and Harris was growing increasingly suspicious of the family's involvement. But there was one more person who could hold the key to unlocking the full truth: Jake Spencer, Emily's father. Jake had remained quiet since the beginning of the investigation. He had barely spoken during his initial interview, and he'd continued to keep his distance throughout. Harris had the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. It was time to confront him directly. Jake Spencer's home was quiet, the air heavy with grief, as though the walls themselves absorbed the sorrow of the loss. The same oppressive stillness from the day before hung in the air as Harris stepped inside. Jake was seated in the living room, staring blankly at the floor, as if lost in thought. When he saw Harris, he didn't stand, just nodded wearily. "Detective Harris," Jake said in a low, hoarse voice. "I suppose you're here to ask me more questions." Harris didn't waste any time with pleasantries. She needed answers. "Jake, I need you to tell me what happened between you and Emily. Your wife claims she was the only one who knew about the pregnancy, but I have reason to believe she's not telling the whole truth. Did you know? Jake looked up at her, his face a mask of confusion and sorrow. What are you talking about? I, I didn't know she was pregnant. Carla didn't tell me. You didn't know about Emily's pregnancy? Harris repeated, studying his face carefully. No, Jake said, shaking his head slowly. I didn't know. Emily never said anything about it. Carla, she didn't tell me either. I just thought we were going through a rough patch, you know? Raising teenagers is hard, especially after everything with Mark. I was focused on work, and Carla, she always took care of things. But this, Emily's death, it's, it's destroying me. Harris took a breath. She had to push harder. Your wife said she didn't want to tell you because she thought you would be furious. But now we have evidence that you and Emily weren't as close as you might have appeared. There's been tension in your marriage for some time, hasn't there, Jake? Can you deny that? Jake flinched at her words, and Harris could see the pain in his eyes. Yes, he admitted, his voice breaking. There's been tension, but I never wanted to hurt Emily. I never wanted her to be caught in the middle of whatever was going on between me and Carla. Harris's gaze hardened. Jake, the evidence is clear. Emily didn't just die from a fall. She was attacked. There's blunt force trauma to her head, and she was strangled. You need to tell me the truth. What happened? Jake swallowed hard, his face a portrait of guilt and disbelief. For the first time since Harris had met him, he seemed to collapse under the weight of the situation. I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't want to hurt her. Harris stood still, the realization dawning on her. You knew, didn't you? You knew about Emily's pregnancy. You found out, and you couldn't stand the idea of her having a child. Jake buried his face in his hands, sobbing openly now. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't want anyone to find out. The thought of another child, especially with everything that happened before, it made me lose control. Harris felt her stomach churn. This wasn't the grieving father she had first encountered. This was a man who had hidden his darkest thoughts behind a mask of sorrow. His confession came like a flood of guilt, and the full extent of the tragedy began to unfold. I didn't mean to kill her, Jake whispered, barely able to speak the words. But I was so scared of what it would do to the family, to Carla. She was already upset about everything. And then I found out about the pregnancy. I just couldn't let her have it. I couldn't. Investigation report. Subject: Jake Spencer, 47, father of Emily Spencer. Details: Jake Spencer confessed to having learned about his daughter's pregnancy. He admitted to feeling overwhelmed with fear and guilt. In an emotional breakdown, Jake admitted that he lost control and, in a fit of panic, attacked Emily. He claimed the attack was not premeditated, but stemmed from his deep-rooted fear of the consequences of Emily's pregnancy. Jake Spencer's actions were driven by panic, fear of the pregnancy's implications, and the underlying issues within his marriage. He admitted to striking Emily in a moment of overwhelming emotion, which led to her death by strangulation. The truth had been uncovered. Emily Spencer's death was not an accident, and it was not solely the result of Carla's actions. Both Carla and Jake had contributed to the events leading up to Emily's tragic demise. The unspoken fear of a ruined family, the desperate desire to keep their lives intact, had pushed them to commit an unforgivable act. The Spencer family's secret had finally been revealed, but as always, the cost of that truth was steep, and the devastation it caused would ripple through their lives forever. Detective Laura Harris sat in her car outside the Spencer household, the weight of the past few days pressing heavily on her chest. She'd just finished conducting her final round of interviews with both Jake and Carla Spencer, and while the confessions had been painstakingly slow to come, they were now on the record. The truth about Emily's death had been revealed in pieces, first from Carla, then from Jake, and yet Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing, a final critical element that could tie it all together. The murder was not simple. It was not just an isolated crime of passion or a moment of blind panic. It was the result of fear, guilt, and secrecy, an unholy trinity of emotions that had consumed the Spencer family, leading to a tragic and irreversible outcome. But there was one more person Harris needed to understand better: Emily herself. What had driven Emily to confront her parents about her pregnancy in the first place? And more importantly, what had happened to make her speak out just days before her death, knowing full well that it could destroy everything? As Harris sat in the car, she pulled out the file on Emily Spencer. She had already gone through the interviews and the coroner's reports, but now she needed to go deeper. She needed to piece together who Emily had been in her final months of life. What had changed in her behavior, and why? The first place Harris decided to look was Emily's social media activity. In today's digital world, everyone left a trail of breadcrumbs: conversations, posts, photos, messages. Harris pulled up Emily's account on her phone, scrolling through pictures of a young girl who had seemingly lived a carefree life. There were smiles, high school dances, beach trips, and friends. But recently, there had been fewer posts. The final few months showed a stark contrast to her earlier life: a young woman who was withdrawn, angry, and clearly distressed. Harris noted that Emily had posted a series of cryptic messages that seemed to allude to a growing sense of isolation and a struggle with her family. One post stood out in particular. It was a photo of Emily holding a test. The words, "Everything is about to change. I'm scared," written as a caption. The post was dated only a month before her death. The unease in Emily's words was palpable, but it was the comments on the post that caught Harris's attention. The first comment came from Derek Montgomery, Emily's boyfriend. "I'm here for you, always." But there were others too. Her best friend Mia commented, "You're not alone. We'll figure this out together." And then, curiously, there was a comment from Carla, her mother. "You need to tell us what's going on. Please." Harris stared at the comment. Carla had been urging Emily to talk, but Emily had never replied. The tension in the family was evident even before Emily's tragic death. It was clear now that Emily had been carrying the weight of this secret on her own, and while she had confided in Derek and Mia, the person who should have been her support, her mother, had only exacerbated her fear. Carla's attempt to gain control over Emily's situation was evident in her words. She had been pushing her daughter toward a confession, but Emily had resisted. Harris needed to know more about that resistance, so she called in Mia, Emily's best friend. It was time to hear from someone who had seen Emily's emotional state in the final months of her life. Mia Mitchell sat across from Harris in the quiet interview room at the police station, her hands nervously twisting together. She was a petite young woman, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, her brown eyes wide with concern. "Thank you for coming in, Mia," Harris said, her voice calm and professional. "I know this has been incredibly difficult, but I need your help to understand what happened in the days leading up to Emily's death." Mia nodded, wiping at her eyes as though trying to prevent herself from breaking down again. "I still can't believe she's gone," she whispered. I I never thought anything like this would happen." Harris leaned forward, her expression sympathetic. "Mia, I need to know about the last few weeks. How was Emily? Was she acting different? What happened when she started pulling away from her parents?" Mia hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. She wasn't herself. She became distant, withdrawn. I could tell something was bothering her, but she wouldn't talk about it at first. I kept asking her if everything was okay, and she'd just say that she was fine. But then, one night, she called me and told me she had to talk to me in person. That's when she told me about the pregnancy." Harris nodded slowly. "And what did she say?" "She was terrified," Mia said, her voice shaking. "She didn't know what to do. She thought she could handle it on her own, but she was scared. She was afraid of her parents' reaction, especially her mom's. I told her that she didn't have to do this alone, that I was there for her. I told her we could figure it out together. But she kept saying that she didn't want to ruin everything, that she didn't want her parents to find out. It was like she was already carrying this huge burden, and it was breaking her." Mia took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to continue. "And then one night, she told me she was going to tell them. She said she couldn't keep hiding it. I think she wanted to come clean, but I don't think she ever thought it would end like this. I, I didn't even know she'd talked to her mom until after everything happened. Harris leaned back, absorbing Mia's words. Did Emily ever say anything about how her mom was acting? Did she seem afraid of Carla? Mia shook her head. No, not afraid exactly, but I think she was worried about how her mom would react. Carla, she's always been very controlling. I think Emily felt like she had to meet her expectations, and she was scared that telling her would just make everything worse. Harris took note of Mia's observations. Emily had confided in her best friend, but had kept the full extent of her emotional turmoil hidden from her mother. It was a critical piece of the puzzle. Carla had been too focused on controlling the situation, and Emily had been too scared to fully open up. In the end, that fear had cost her her life. Harris left the interview room and made her way to the police station's small conference room where her team was waiting. She could feel the weight of the case bearing down on her, but now the pieces were falling into place. Emily had been isolated in her final days, torn between the desire to come clean and the fear of what would happen if she did. Her parents had pushed her into a corner, and in the end, it was too much. Okay, Harris said, taking a seat at the head of the table. We have the truth about the family dynamics now. Carla and Jake Spencer were both involved in their daughter's death, but Emily was the catalyst. She was the one who finally reached her breaking point and was going to tell her parents the truth. She paused, letting the information sink in. What we're dealing with is a family tragedy, complicated by fear, control, and secrecy. Carla and Jake Spencer both had a hand in their daughter's death, but Emily was ultimately the victim of their inability to communicate, their desire to hide the truth. There was silence in the room as Harris finished speaking. The weight of the case was heavy, but it was also clear. This was not a simple murder. It was the consequence of years of tension, fear, and deception within a family. Now, Harris said, breaking the silence, we'll begin preparations to move forward with charges, but we need to be sure the entire story is out. Carla and Jake Spencer need to be held accountable for what they did. The team nodded, their expressions resolute. They were on the cusp of solving the case, but the heartbreak of the truth was undeniable. Investigation report. Subject, Emily Spencer, 17, victim. Details. Emily Spencer's emotional distress in the weeks leading up to her death was rooted in a combination of fear, guilt, and the secret of her pregnancy. She had planned to come clean to her parents, but the fear of their reaction, especially her mother's, ultimately led to her death. Both Carla and Jake Spencer were implicated in her death, with both parents expressing fear and guilt regarding the pregnancy. Emily had been isolated in her final days and had been unable to fully open up to her family. Emily Spencer's fear of her parents' reaction to her pregnancy, especially her mother's control, played a significant role in her decision to keep the truth hidden. Her eventual decision to confront her parents contributed directly to the chain of events leading to her death. Harris knew that bringing the Spencer family to justice wouldn't bring Emily back, but it was the only way to ensure that her death wasn't in vain. The truth was finally clear, and the Spencer family would have to face the consequences of their actions. The weeks following the confessions were filled with paperwork, legal meetings, and the careful construction of a case that would ultimately decide the fates of Carla and Jake Spencer. Detective Laura Harris had done her part, piecing together the web of lies, fear, and control that had surrounded Emily Spencer's tragic death. But now, as the case moved from investigation to trial preparation, the weight of the case had become more than just professional. It had become personal. For Harris, the case felt like a mirror into her own life. The echoes of Emily's isolation, her struggle for control, and the eventual breaking point rang too close to home. She had seen families fall apart before, but this case, this family, struck her with a depth she hadn't expected. There had been no easy answers, no clear line between the victim and the perpetrators. Emily's death had been a culmination of years of tension, secrets, and misguided decisions. But as she sat in her office late one evening, reviewing the final pieces of evidence, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that there was something left unsaid. Carla and Jake had confessed, sort of, but something about their confessions felt rehearsed, too calculated. She had seen it before, the look of someone who was trying to save themselves by throwing the other person under the bus. In Carla's confession, there had been a moment where she mentioned, "I had no choice," as if the idea of Emily's pregnancy had left her with no other option. Carla had justified her actions, painting herself as a desperate mother trapped in an impossible situation. Jake's confession had followed a similar line, though his guilt was more apparent. He had admitted to the physical violence, but there was something in his demeanor, his self-hatred, that made Harris question how much of his actions had been prompted by fear of losing control, and how much was simply a desperate attempt to bury his own role in the family's dysfunction. Now, Harris needed to push harder. She couldn't let the story end here, with confessions that barely scratched the surface of the truth. It was time to put the final pieces together. The trial began in a packed courtroom, the tension palpable as Carla and Jake Spencer sat in the defendants' chairs, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, guilt, and fear. They had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder for Emily's death, but they had not yet been sentenced. The courtroom was filled with friends, family, and media personnel. Emily's story had caught the public's attention, and now the case would unfold in front of everyone. Detective Harris sat in the back of the courtroom, observing as the defense and prosecution delivered their opening statements. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Allison Burke, painted a vivid picture of Emily's final days. She described how Emily had been a bright young woman, full of life, until the weight of the pregnancy and the secret she carried became too much for her to handle. The prosecutor detailed the fear Emily had felt in the days leading up to her death, how she had attempted to confide in her parents but was shut down by their own guilt and control. Harris had already heard the prosecutor's case. She had been briefed on the facts, but it was the victim impact statements that always hit hardest. Emily's best friend, Mia Mitchell, took the stand first. The room was silent as Mia spoke about her friendship with Emily, how she had tried to offer support during those last difficult weeks, and how devastated she had been when Emily was killed. Mia's voice cracked as she told the court about the last conversation she had with Emily, the one where Emily said she was finally going to tell her parents the truth. It was a moment that left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. The weight of that confession, Emily's final act of courage, hung in the air. After Mia's testimony, it was time for the defense to make its case. Carla Spencer's attorney, a calm and measured man named Thomas Gregor, stood and began his statement. He spoke of Carla's remorse, how she had been a mother pushed to the edge. He described how Carla had been under immense pressure, both from the secret of Emily's pregnancy and the strain in her marriage. He emphasized that Carla had never intended for Emily to die. She had just lost control in the heat of an argument. The actions that led to Emily's death were born out of fear, Gregor said, his voice steady. Carla Spencer was a mother who felt trapped, who saw the future of her family unraveling before her eyes. She did what she thought was necessary to protect her daughter. She never meant for things to go this far. Jake Spencer's attorney, a different, more stern lawyer named Charles Redding, took a similar approach. He painted Jake as a man who had been overwhelmed by the chaos in his home, unable to cope with the emotional burden of his wife's secret and the revelation of his daughter's pregnancy. Redding spoke of Jake's history of being a hardworking father who had always tried to provide for his family, but who had never been prepared for the emotional challenges that had come with his daughter's pregnancy. Jake Spencer made a grievous mistake, one that he will have to live with for the rest of his life, Redding argued. But it was a mistake born from a place of fear and confusion. He had no idea how to react, how to handle the situation, and in that moment of panic, he acted out of pure terror. Harris sat back watching the defense's tactics unfold. She couldn't deny that both Carla and Jake had been under immense stress, but that didn't change the facts. It didn't change the truth of Emily's death. They had killed her, not in a moment of blind panic, but in a cold, calculated attempt to protect themselves from the consequences of their own mistakes. The pregnancy had been a catalyst, but the deeper issues, control, fear, guilt, had pushed them over the edge. They had tried to protect their own lives at the cost of their daughters. As the trial continued, it became clear that both Carla and Jake were willing to paint themselves as victims of circumstance. They had been caught in a web of fear, and they had acted out of desperation. But Harris knew that the truth was more complicated than that. They had both played a role in Emily's death, And while their actions might have been born from fear, it was no excuse for murder. The sentencing phase of the trial came quickly. Carla and Jake Spencer were both found guilty of second-degree murder, and though they had pleaded guilty, the emotional weight of the courtroom was still heavy. The judge, after hearing victim impact statements from Mia, Emily's extended family, and even the detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case, sentenced both Carla and Jake to 25 years to life in prison. The judge's gavel fell with a resounding thud, signaling the end of the trial, but it was not the end of the pain. For Mia, for Emily's extended family, for those who had known the girl who had once been full of promise, there would never be a sense of true closure. Emily Spencer had been a victim not just of her family's actions, but of the years of secrecy and emotional control that had surrounded her. As Harris walked out of the courtroom, she felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling over her. The case was over, but the memories of Emily's struggle would stay with her for a long time. She had uncovered the truth, but in the end, there had been no real victory. The Spencer family was broken beyond repair, and Emily would never come back. But at least in the end, the truth had been spoken. And sometimes that was all the justice a case could offer. Final investigation report. Subjects: Carla and Jake Spencer, both convicted of second-degree murder. Details: both Carla and Jake Spencer were found guilty of their daughter Emily's death. The couple's actions stem from a mix of fear, guilt, and control, which led to Emily's tragic demise. Both have been sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The death of Emily Spencer was the result of a breakdown in familial communication, control, and secrecy. Both parents, driven by fear and guilt over Emily's pregnancy, contributed to her death. Their inability to support Emily in her time of need was ultimately their downfall. With the trial over, the case was officially closed. But for Detective Laura Harris, the haunting image of Emily Spencer, the bright young woman who had been crushed under the weight of her family's expectations, would stay with her, a reminder that sometimes the greatest tragedies came not from the outside world, but from within.